I'm Dave Dinkle, and today we're going to look at another of our video series of actual recent deals. Now, this is an example of a $61,338.39 profit on a multifamily property flip, including a $10,000 lost earnest money deposit from the first buyer of this transaction. The following is a real estate deal that was actually recently completed by us or a student, in this case a student. The deal exemplifies some of the various aspects of how to do these no money transactions. So as not to embarrass anyone included in this transaction, all parties have been kept anonymous. I'm not an attorney, CPA, or realtor, and any information derived from this presentation is not to be construed as legal or accounting advice. This is an example of a listed short sale where the first buyer did not close and lost his $10,000 earnest money deposit. Because the student used the proper contract language, he was able to get the earnest money deposit. Because he lost the buyer, he decided to go ahead and close on the transaction, but since he had no money, he used a hard money lender to close the first leg and carry the property until another buyer could be found. Total time in the deal was about 5 months, and there was a deed restriction of 90 days involved. There was no money involved because the student got a hard money loan for the principal amount of the money needed. He borrowed the deposits required and the little bit of cash they needed to close from a friend. There was no credit involved because there was no conventional lender involved. There was no risk really because he had none of his personal money in the transaction. I call this deal the power of persistence once again. The deal was actually found on Reafax as a listed short sale. The student contacted the listing agent who said that another investor had canceled the deal and it was again available. That other investor that had canceled the deal realized after he got it that it was in pretty rugged shape. He just didn't want to go through and have all the hassles with what needed to be done to it. The property was a multifamily that had been boarded up for some time when the owner just simply decided he'd had enough of the tenants. He evicted the tenants and boarded the property up. Ironically, the exterior was very rough because it had sort of been vandalized, but each unit inside was in move-in shape. The student made his offer $15,000 below what was the lender-approved short sale price, and the lender countered at $13,500 below their own approved price for a net price to the student of $46,500. As I said, there was a 90-day deed restriction was the reason the student had to carry it because the end buyers that he got wanted to wait out the deed restriction before it was transferred. The student found a buyer for $110,000 from his buyer's list, but this is the one that backed out. Second buyer came forward for $99,000. He also put up a $10,000 earnest money deposit. The student's first buyer did not want to wait for the short sale to be approved because it took so long, and despite assurances from the student, the listing agent, and even the loss mitigation representative with the lender, the first buyer decided to cancel just before the scheduled closing and move on. So the student had to get hard money to close and literally carry the property until he found another buyer. The student put out bandit signs in the neighborhood on successive weekends and found a new buyer for the entire transaction, but from start to finish it took literally 5 months. Now, most investors would not be willing to stick it out this long, but persistence paid off in a big way in this particular deal. So here we are looking at the A to B, first leg of the transaction, HUD-1 closing statement. Now remember, this is the A to B original HUD, so this is from the original seller to the student. Again, as usual, I've taken off the names and locations and everything else so as not to embarrass anyone. The student is the buyer, left-hand side of the HUD statement is always for the buyer, right-hand side is the seller. Sales price and purchase price are the same, $46,500. Now this is a short sale, and one of the things we're going to see here is that the seller doesn't get any money. But here we go. These are the expenses from side 2 for the student, and they amount to over $5,000. So we're going to go and look at that and see what all that's about. The expenses to the seller, who were paid by the lender in effect, amounted to $4,800, and those would have included a commission to the listing agent. So there's a $1,000 deposit that the student had borrowed to put up in the transaction. Remember that his end buyer put up $10,000 in both cases. So if the student wanted to, in this first A to B transaction, just walk away from it and not close, he would have netted a $9,000 profit. His net profit would have been $10,000 lost earnest money deposit minus the $1,000 that he would have lost to the seller. In this case, it would have been the property owner as a short sale. So here's the payoff for the actual loan to the seller. And there's, once again, that's the amount that was due from the hard money lender to close the transaction, Almost. Hard money lender could have put up a little more money. He chose not to put up the entire amount. This, of course, is the accrued taxes from the beginning of the year. And here's the bottom line on the page. And with accrued taxes, why always the buyer and seller amounts will be the same. It's a debit to the seller, credit to the buyer. But here you can see it's $2,218.48 that the student had to bring to closing. Most importantly, the seller received nothing. Now that's what a short sale is supposed to look like. In some cases, on a short sale, the seller might receive cash for keys, but in this case he did not because it's an investment property. So here's page 2 of the HUD. These are the fees that the hard money lender charged, or his attorney charged, for processing perhaps the loan documents and so on. Up here is the commission that I mentioned to you for the transaction itself, $2,790. It went to the listing agent. This is accrued interest. This is the settlement charge by closing agent. For the student it was $500, but it was $950 to the seller. This is one way for the closing agent to have the property net out to zero, is to charge more fees and expenses on the second page, and then they can just literally play with these. Title or abstract fee. These are the title insurance for the property. Now why would you need title insurance? Because you have a lender in there and you want to know you have as clear and marketable a title as possible. If it's not clear and marketable, then it's only going to be insurable. These are additional charges for endorsements and assignments of, it says assignments of rents, but it's actually a recording fee to the clerk of the court, as you can see it here. Okay, and these are some other recording fees and various miscellaneous costs to record the mortgage in the public record. Here's a lien search fee, what is called a compliance fee, and I'm not sure who got that. I took the name out. And there's a water bill. See this water due? It's a pretty significant number. Typically, a closing agent doesn't look for these liens because they're not in the public record. As a matter of fact, they used to be in the public record, but most municipalities don't file them anymore because it sticks to the property, and they know that any new owner that comes along and eventually will turn on the water, they have to come down and have the city turn on the water, and then the city charges everything that's due to the new buyer, new owner. So here's what we have, $5,617 expenses we saw on page 1 versus $4,000 and change for the seller. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the second leg of the transaction. Remember, the student closed using hard money lender's money and some borrowed money of his own at $2,200. Now this is the second leg that took place a number of months later, actually about 3.5 months later because of the deed restriction being 90 days. So here's the sales price. As you can see, it's $99,000. I mentioned it earlier. The fees to the buyer now, this is the end buyer C, were $1,093 from page 2. There's the $10,000 deposit that this end buyer put up again. The fees for the student's closings on the second page are $1,500. Here's the payoff for the hard money loan, $41,500 and change, and it includes accrued interest. Here's accrued property taxes for both the buyer and the seller, and again they're the same amount, but they're different than they were in the A to B because this is not a double closing. It's not the same day. It's later, so they have larger amounts. So here's the bottom line. The student received $54,774.73, and the buyer had to bring in $89,000 to close. So this is page 2 of the HUD statement, and let's go through it real quick. Here's the attorney's fees. They're both $450. Abstract or title search is also $200 and change. Title insurance itself, it's a promulgated rate. I think it's $500 and change. Whatever, I barely see it here. I'm sorry. This is a wire fee. Now, this is a source of profit for many of the closing agents because they have an automatic wire system in their bank that doesn't charge them anything, but they charge for it, so that's a nice little deal. Here's recording fees again. Here's doc stamps on the transfer of the actual property itself. E-record fee, electronic recording fee in the state. Lien search, and that's actually a pretty inexpensive lien search. Sometimes they're much more here. Long and short of it is the end buyer C has $1,000 and change closing costs. Student, as the seller of the property, has $1,593. Here's the final result of this transaction. Student first contracted, then actually purchased the property because he had to off the MLS as a short sale. He found it on reafax.com, prospecting in the Tri-County area we're in. He had a hard money loan for the A to B purchase, borrowed the additional $2,200 he needed to close, as well as the $1,000 loan, as well as the $1,000 original earnest money deposit. The first buyer he had couldn't close, or decided not to close rather, and lost his $10,000 earnest money deposit. The student used a bandit sign in the neighborhood to get a second buyer who closed, and the student's net profit for this no money out-of-pocket transaction was proceeds on the HUD $54,538.39 plus the $10,000 earnest money deposit lost by the first buyer, less his payback of $2,200 and $1,000 that he borrowed for the earnest money deposits and the net that he needed to close. So his net profit was $61,338.39. And it was a milestone deal in this student's life because he decided to fire his boss because he made less than half of this amount on an annual basis at his full-time job. He decided to do real estate investing full-time. Thanks very much for joining me for this no money, no credit, and no risk deal.